Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today I want to talk about familiars. More specifically, I want to talk about why familiars aren't really a thing in Wicca. The idea of a familiar spirit, or more broadly, of some kind of a spirit that assists the magician in their work, is pervasive in esotericism and folklore all over the world. You find it in the Greek magical papyri, you find it in the Solomonic tradition, you find it in various forms of esoteric Taoism and African diaspora religions. It's not always called the same thing. There are various different understandings of what's going on in that relationship, what the power hierarchy is, what kinds of spirits are participating in the relationship. But the idea that as a magical practitioner you have a relationship with a spirit who assists you in executing the tasks that you're trying to execute, pretty foundational to magic across the world. And it certainly exists in European folklore, where there's the idea of a familiar spirit. And looking at a lot of witch folklore and sort of records from accounts of witchcraft and things like that from the early modern period, generally speaking, these familiars were understood to be spirits. Nowadays, we tend to think of a familiar as like a black cat that belongs to the witch, but in the early modern period, familiars were really understood to be spirits rather than like pets. Um, and oftentimes familiars looked like humans, so there are a lot of accounts of a familiar being a man dressed in black, or a fairy of some kind. There's a scholar named Julia Phillips who's done a lot of really wonderful work on that, actually. And Emma Wilby has also done really interesting stuff on familiars and fairies in witch folklore. But so, you have this idea of a spirit of some kind that is given to the witch, or that forms a relationship with the witch in order to help her in her magic. And uh, during witch trials, written from the Christian point of view, this spirit is, of course, an imp or a demon or some kind of malevolent spirit that is in league with the witch to work maleficia across, the good, God-fearing Christian population. But sort of whether the spirit is demonic or more of like a fairy really kind of just depends on who's telling the story. Regardless, it's generally considered a spirit of some kind. Often a spirit in animal form as well as human form. So there are various accounts of witches being given an imp that takes the form of a toad or a cat and suckles at their teat and drinks blood from them. A lot of accounts of a familiar being fed with blood. But regardless, right, there's something that isn't quite an ordinary animal, but that might look like an animal or a person and participates in the witch's magic. That's kind of the basic idea of a familiar in witchcraft folklore. And then Margaret Murray comes along. Margaret Murray, the author of The Witch Cult in Western Europe and of The God of the Witches, sort of famous expounder of the witch cult hypothesis, who suggested that the people who were tried and convicted as witches were not the victims of a mass hysteria, but were, in fact, the persecuted practitioners of a surviving pre-Christian witch religion. We now know that that idea is totally bogus, but it was very popular in the early 20th century. And Margaret Murray is reading through accounts from witch trials and trying to find non-supernatural explanations for all of the things that are going on, because she wants to describe witchcraft as merely sort of the practice of a religion rather than anything fantastical or folkloric. And Murray reads these accounts of familiars and decides that witch familiars were actually just ordinary animals that witches kept and were involved with. And Murray makes a really interesting distinction that I think has kind of disappeared from the popular consciousness, which is sort of a shame. She makes a distinction between a divining familiar and a domestic or magical familiar. And the domestic familiar is more the kind of thing that we have in our popular consciousness when we think of a witch's familiar, right? So the domestic familiar was, according to Margaret Murray, a pet kept by the witch, a domestic animal of some kind, a cat, a dog, a toad, a rat, something small that could live inside the home, that the witch fed regularly, often like putting a drop of her blood into the food or whatever in order to establish a bond. And this animal, in addition to being a pet, was understood to participate or aid in the witch's spells in some meaningful way. So that's kind of the image of the familiar that we're accustomed to. Murray also talks about this other thing, the divining familiar, that has completely dropped out of discourse about witches, and I kind of wish that we could bring it back. The divining familiar, according to Margaret Murray, is not a specific animal, but is a type of animal. And when a witch is initiated into the witch cult, she is told that this type of animal is her divinatory animal, and she is taught how to perform divination by reading the behavior of animals of this kind. So you might be told that your divining animal is a sheep, and then someone in your coven would teach you how to do sheep-based divination, and you would learn how to, have a question in mind and then observe the movements of sheep. Is this sheep, any given sheep? You could go find a sheep, and is this sheep agitated? Is it behaving normally? Is it particularly calm? And based on how it acts, you could then divine the answers to your question. Oftentimes, divining familiars were farm animals or game animals of some kind. So, right, there are descriptions of sheep and cows and deer. There are also descriptions of witches divining according to birds, and then black dogs or cats are also particularly popular. So, you would ask a question, and then you would look at, like, a stray dog, and based on the dog's behavior, you would find the answer to your question. And obviously there's, like, a tradition of augury and other forms. Excuse me. No, there might be another sneeze coming. Other forms of divination by the behavior of animals, right? Like, that has existed as long as divination has existed. But the idea that that is a specific kind of witch divination, and that you, as a new witch, would be taught a specific animal to use as your divinatory animal, is really, really interesting to me, and hasn't really come into any part of the witchcraft revival that I know of. I'm sure there are individual practitioners who are, like, performing sheep divination, but it's not like it's part of our collective consciousness and our current understanding of, like, what witches do, which I think is kind of a shame. But so regardless, Murray introduces this distinction between two different types of animals that can be used by the witch as a familiar, either for magical or divinatory purposes. And that is, I think, a lot of where we get our contemporary idea that a familiar is a witch's pet, or rather a pet with whom a witch has a particularly strong magical connection. So you will today find a lot of practitioners who have a pet, involve their pet in their magic somehow, and refer to their pet as a familiar. That's a thing that people do. And I think that comes largely out of this idea that we see in Margaret Murray, that accounts of familiars in witchcraft folklore and witchcraft trials are really just accounts of pets or other domestic animals. Murray may well not have been the first person to put forward that particular idea, but she certainly popularized it, right? This is the case with a lot of Murray's ideas, is that there were people earlier saying kind of similar things, but Murray brings these ideas together and presents them in a way that seizes the popular imagination. So we can credit her with popularizing a lot of these ideas, even if she isn't their originator. It's interesting to me, thinking about familiars, thinking about how important familiars are to our idea of witchcraft, that familiars aren't really a thing in Wicca. Again, like, you have individual practitioners who might have a pet and refer to that pet as their familiar, or who might form a relationship with a spirit that is similar to descriptions of relationships between a witch and a familiar spirit in folklore, right? So you might have individual witches who have a relationship with a nature spirit or a fairy or an ancestral spirit or something of that sort that kind of serves as that familiar relationship. But that's largely a matter of individual practitioners, or maybe something that's done on a coven-by-coven basis. You might also have, like, a coven fetch spirit is something that some covens do. But the idea of, like, witches have familiars, and that is definitional to witchcraft, didn't really make its way into, at least the early days of Wicca. And it's not something we see, like, if you ever read Gerald Gardner's books, there's not really much of a description of familiars. It's not a thing that seems terribly important to him. There's casual mention of it, but it's not part of the allegedly surviving witch cult that he presents. And there's really not much evidence to indicate that the people he was involved with early on thought of familiars as an important part of their practice. And I find that really curious. I don't have a familiar spirit, nor do I have a pet that I refer to as a familiar. I have close relationships with a couple of different spirits, and those relationships are magical and do sometimes involve, asking those spirits for assistance in my spell work. But I don't really think of any of those spirits as being my familiar, or as being in a relationship to me that is analogous to what witches have with their familiars in the various folkloric accounts. Those are different kinds of relationships. And, I'm really curious as to why familiars aren't really a thing in Wicca. My hypothesis, and this is not a well-informed hypothesis, this is just conjecture on my part, and I could very well be wrong. But my hypothesis is that by the time the New Forest Coven comes together, and certainly by the time that Gerald Gardner is initiated in the late 1930s, the idea of a witch's familiar is pretty solidly cemented as an animal, as a pet, rather than like a familiar spirit, an imp or a demon or a fairy. And my hypothesis is that the members of the New Forest Coven just weren't animal people. I could be wrong about that, but from what I've read, the research that's been done by like Philip Heselton or Christina Oakley Harrington, I haven't seen anything to indicate that any of them was an enormous lover of animals, beyond sort of the general romanticized love of nature that they all seem to have had. I don't know of any of them having pets. To the best of my knowledge, Gerald Gardner didn't have pets. And if you think of a familiar as a witch's pet, if like that's the principal idea of a familiar that you have in your mind, and you're not a person who has or wants pets, then familiars just aren't going to feature very strongly in your attempt at a witchcraft revival. Now, there are sort of other influential figures in Wicca who were really big animal people. So famously, Patricia Crowther is a huge animal person, loves animals. A lot of her magical work is around animal advocacy. Eleanor Bone also famously was a pet lover. And so like there are other people who were involved in Wicca who had these really important relationships with animals that were often magical. But to the best of my knowledge, like the early days, Gardner, the people who brought Gardner in, and Gardner's first few initiates, I don't know of anyone there who was significantly an animal lover. Now, these were also people who were really careful to protect their identities by and large, so there's a measure of privacy there where like there are certain things that I just will never know about them. That's because they have their privacy. But if I'm speculating about why the idea of a familiar didn't make its way in as sort of one of the fundamental witchcraft things that belong to Wicca, that's my best guess as to why. So, I don't know, just some Tuesday morning thoughts. If you have other thoughts about familiars in Wicca, if you have a familiar, I'd be really curious to hear about what that relationship is like, whether with an animal or with a spirit. If you are Wiccan and a familiar is a significant feature of your practice as a Wiccan, again, I'd be really interested to hear about that. But yeah, I mean, it seems from everything I have observed in the Wiccan community, it seems like the sort of relationship that some people have, but that's really treated as optional in Wicca. It's not treated as sort of one of the basic defining elements of Wicca, and I find that really fascinating. So that's about all I have for today. Thank you so much, and I will talk to you sometime soon. I will talk to you sometime soon. I speak English.